after I finished my degree, I came back to Cambridge and was living there for a little while. And I think a lot of what I'd been interested in when I was doing my undergraduate degree was architecture and history generally. And when I came back to Cambridge, I ended up getting one of my other jobs was at the Faculty of Architecture, and was talking to somebody there who's mentioned about a course that was just beginning, which is in building history, which is kind of like I suppose, like buildings archaeology. So understanding the history of buildings from what's left of them, I suppose, and piecing together the history and the phasing of buildings. So I was interested in this course and ended up signing up for that and getting a place. You had to do a kind of 6-month placement. I could have been posted to do almost anything, and I think indeed some people ended up doing some pretty dreary stuff. I think somebody got telephone exchanges, and I went in and saw the head of the research department in Cambridge, and they said, "Yeah, we've got a project coming up on pubs built in the 20th century. Do you think that'd be of interest to you?" I said, "I think it probably would be, yeah." And so I kind of got into it it was just by complete chance, and I thought it was a stitch up because the course director knew we'd sort of often kind of convene to the pub after a day of going round and looking at timber frame buildings or what have you, and I thought it might have been a kind of elaborate kind of stitch up. It turned out to be that was it, and it was fantastic. And ended up travelling all around the country. It was national projects, all of England, looking at pubs built from 1914 onwards, and it was part of a kind of reactive. These thematic projects that they did a lot of at the time, which were based on threats to particular building types. So there was a project around the same time on libraries when lots of those were closing down, and lots of pubs were, as they still are sadly, were closing, and particularly ones built in the 20s and 30s, which are the kind of first, of course, the first kind of generation of pubs to be built with substantial car parks and gardens and lots of kind of distracting elements to them. But they obviously had kind of huge plots as a result. They were sort of particularly vulnerable to being converted to supermarkets and various other kind of they had sort of the land value hugely exceeded their kind of rateable value as pubs. So they were kind of a threat building type, and that was a rationale. It wasn't just a big lark. It was, but it wasn't. There was some sort of purpose to it, I suppose. So that's kind of how it started off.
I was going to say, when you travelled around all these pubs, did you have a drink, or was it just work after a while?
Well, I did in quite a few of them. I mean, one of the slightly tricky elements to this is quite early in the project, somebody did go into a pub and announce that they were looking for English heritage, and it kind of spooked the owner of one of these pubs in the Midlands. This was, and it ended up being knocked down a few weeks later, and so we were kind of a bit worried really about sort of announcing, because we were there just to sort of as part of a kind of writing a report on the history of these pubs and which ones survived. So in my current job, I'd be looking at whether we were recommending a building to be listed, whereas with this, we were just going around to try and understand the building type. So we didn't want to sort of create any alarm unnecessarily, and because we had this issue where we don't really know exactly what happened, but there was some sort of concern that it may have been somebody saying they're from English heritage, and the publican then thinking, calling the bulldozers in. So we tried to kind of blend in as much as possible. So I did have a drink at a few of them, so as to not be too conspicuous, but
purely for professional reasons.
But quite a few of them. I mean, it ended up great though. It was. We were having to sort of fit in so many pubs. And a lot of them I was sort of driving to in a day. So, we had like a few days where I did Leeds and Sheffield in the same day and drove between all of the pubs. And so I couldn't drink. I was driving there and back, and we were sort of making sort of 20-minute stop-offs in each of the pubs. So it was there were a few of them. Like it did actually become a bit of an ordeal. A few of the kind of really like really long days. Um, and I have to say, like one of the things that we realised across the project is some of the pubs were really well preserved through love and care of a publican who was greatly proud of their pub, but quite a few of them survived well because of benign neglect, and you had a few of really the best preserved pubs were really kind of were really in a pretty kind of crummy state, um, and were not kind of the easiest places to be in, and we look really conspicuous because we're both Southerners, and especially when you're going around a pub in like the suburbs of Liverpool, and you think, what are these two guys doing coming in here drinking an appetizer at sort of 2 in the afternoon? It was so, and we were kind of a bit of a strange pairing because I'd have been probably about 24, 25 when I was doing that, and the other person, she would have been about in her 40s. So we looked. It was sort of couldn't make sense of how we sort of why we were there or who we were, and a lot of people thought we were checking up on benefit scammers.
Did people think you were police?
Well, yeah, we had a bit of that, and the other thing that I think a lot of people thought we were doing is checking up to see if people were sort of showing Sky Sports illegally, because you you're meant to have the pint logo in the corner of the screen, and if they're just showing it with a kind of, I don't know, with a household license,
yeah.
they get big fines. So there was a lot of suspicion. So quite a lot of the job was kind of talking people around and sort of saying, "Oh, we're sort of doing a project on historic pubs," and actually most publicans, once you kind of got them, they got a sense of what you were doing, were really helpful and told us actually an awful lot more than a lot of our documentary research could tell us, because so many of the changes are not really recorded in any way, and so much of it was just in people's memory, or things they'd been told by the landlord that preceded them. So we got an awful lot from that, and we just covered so much. I mean, I think we must have visited, we well into the hundreds over the course of the project. So, I mean,
and Luke, is there an outcome is there an intended outcome, which is there's a listing of some kind, or there's some kind of rating which is applied?
Yeah. So the outcome of this one. So what we were doing was writing a history of the pub. So it was published as the kind of this kind of long, 3-volume tome on the history of the pub between 1918 and 1939. So it was that was the first part, and then there was a whole report on pubs in the post-war era as well, which came a bit after I left. And then a whole series of pubs were listed. The best preserved ones were listed as a kind of outcome of that from the research we did. So it was a protection. It was an exercise in sort of protecting buildings, but also giving a kind of national overview to the development, so they'd be better understood when they were kind of coming up for redevelopment, or if to inform any kind of proposals to make changes. So that was kind of the purpose of it, really, to set out a kind of national overview of the building type. But yes, quite a few of them did get listed. Some really great pubs in amongst it, which in amongst the list that we looked at, and most of them still going strong, which is
So
which is
which ones stand out if you were to recommend some from your great travels?
There were, so I think in the kind of 20s and 30s you kind of got several different strands, but you had what was called the improved pub movement, which was very influential at that time, and that was sort of developing lots of different diversions from just straight up kind of heavy drinking, which was sort of seen to be a big problem at the very start of the 20th century. And so you have something like the Black Horse in Birmingham is a great example. It's actually Wetherspoons now, but it has a bowling green, gardens, a dining hall, the sort of baronial effect, assembly hall above the bars, incredible level of preservation, carved carved work. I mean, it's a real kind of brewer's Tudor, mock Tudor, sprawling great place. But that was a really exceptional example. That one went in, got grade 2 star pub, which was really exceptional. I did a lot of work on Truman's pubs in London, and they were kind of quite interesting because they sort of they steered a kind of middle path between that sort of improved pub movement, and I suppose what were the kind of slightly unreformed boozers of the kind of early, very early sort of decade of the 20th century. Yeah, there was a pub architect who was pretty prolific throughout the period called Sewell, who worked for Truman's. So I think we listed about 7 of those, of which some of them are really excellent. There's the Palm Tree, Mile End. If you've ever been to Columbia Road Market, there's the Royal Oak there. That's a really early Truman's pub, which is superb. The Rose and Crown in Stoke Newington as well. So those kind of give you a kind of good sense of, there was sort of neo-Georgian designs. So lots of pub architecture was always a bit backward looking, and it was always trying to somehow both appeal to people's desire to want to drink and escapism and everything that goes with that, but also conform to the kind of authorities and the licensing magistrates and all of the kind of the parameters that they set for how pubs should be organised, and so there's this kind of balancing act that's kind of quite interesting to read in pubs, that you can see along with all of the kind of social distinctions in kind of different types of bar room and how they're being presented.
It's fascinating, Luke. So I mean, with all of that exposure to pubs and obviously the history and the context, do you have an opinion as to where we go with pubs post-COVID? Is that something which you think is going to be significantly different, or do you think we'll be going back to using them in the more traditional way? What's your thought?
Yeah, I think the thing with COVID is that it really impacted all the sort of wet-led pubs, I suppose, because I mean we even had rules. I don't know if you remember, and when it would have been 2021 in the summer, where you had to sort of have a substantial meal with your pint, and there were all of these kind of, like, looking back on it, slightly daft rules. But I think it hit smaller pubs, wet-led pubs, and I think...
Sorry, wet-led means that it's just booze, no food.
Booze, no food. And I think there's probably a sense in which I mean, I don't know. I think this is sort of kind of anecdotal, I suppose, but I think the ones that I see closing down at a kind of higher rate tend to be smaller pubs, which are essentially kind of boozers. And where you can kind of make a bit more money is when you've sort of got a more substantial food offering. I think you'll probably see a kind of concentration of pubs in urban centres where people are kind of coming in and still wanting to sort of meet up and go for drinks. And I think you're probably getting kind of the ones that aren't in those areas have to be kind of quite strong as destination pubs, I guess, but places people actually want to go to just to go to the pub rather than it being close to something else. So I think the pubs that have done really well are the ones that have just sort of managed to be pretty nimble and find ways to kind of give something to their customers, which is probably beyond just, I guess, beyond just like the kind of very basic kind of offering that you tend to associate with a lot of the pubs that have sadly closed down. There probably is a sense in which quite a few of them were just probably competing with the level of competition made it just unviable. And I think there's probably a sense that that COVID probably did about a decade's worth of closures, I suppose, in that very short space of time, of a lot of those that would have been potentially unviable in the kind of longer term.
Are things levelling out a bit now? Is there some hope, or are things just going to keep on declining, getting harder?
I think one of the things that COVID did was it sort of showed how important pubs were to a sense of how people want to meet, and like particularly where they're kind of one of the kind of key meeting points for like smaller kind of communities or groups within like a particular area, or people who associate with a particular pub. So I think they had such an importance, and I think one of the things I remember, one of the kind of big milestones that the going to have your first pint after that lockdown was kind of a huge thing. And I think that there's probably a sense in which it showed how important they were. But I think at the time that they were most at fret, it kind of crystallised how important they were to people, I suppose. And I think there's just so many inevitable problems that pubs are gonna face as a result of just so many. It's just like an absolute storm of various different things of kind of headwinds, I suppose. Rising prices and energy costs, and like post-COVID, there's probably like a slight kind of decline in trade anyway. But there's so many pubs that are kind of bucking that trend that I think that you end up with some that are just, people value them, and the ones that are valued, I think, will succeed anyway. But it's hard to say, really, isn't it? I mean, it's what there's plenty of pubs that have closed that have been fantastic, and so it's kind of hard to sort of take a kind of too Darwinian a view of it, that it's just the ones that are poor that end up closing. It doesn't seem to really follow that trend too obviously. I don't know. How do you? I mean, obviously, you in St Albans, Martin. Isn't it one of the most heavily pubbed?
It is, but even so, I mean, about 4 or 5 have gone since we moved here, only sort of 5 or 6 years ago. So it's sad, yeah. But it is a bit of an anomaly, St Albans, because it's sort of it's where the camera is based and stuff. So it's I think it's at least 20 still in quite a small area.
Yeah.
But Bales and I grew up in Bedford, and there were lots of nice little pubs in Bedford, and but I went back a couple of years ago. It's a terrible thing to do. Never go back to your happy childhood memories. And I think we talked about this before, but God, so many of them have been. It's sort of Charles Wells is the chain, and they've just been homogenised into the knocked through. Lots of little nooks and crannies have been removed. Laminated menus for the same old beans and chips or whatever. It's the same in the next pub you go to. And so many of them just lost lots of character. I don't know. Have you been back, Bales? You don't drink it. Bales doesn't drink anymore, so maybe he doesn't go to them anyway.
Yeah, exactly. It is weird. Funny enough, I was there the other day because my dad's still there, and I was driving down the high street, which used to have dozens of pubs, and now there's a few, and they're all being Weatherspooned. But there was one which had retained its sort of original character, but it was always like the hardest pub in Bedford. And it's still got it, right? There's still clearly a lot of people looking for a fight in the Cross Keys.
The Cross Keys, I don't know that one. Where's that?
It was halfway down. It's where Silver Street intersected with the High Street.
Okay, no, I didn't go in that one.
yeah, well, for good reason. It was driving past it, I thought, God, that still looks like a place you would avoid. I actually had my son Teddy in the car, and he goes, look at that place. I was like, yeah, look at it. A lot of people looking like they're about to get into a lot of trouble.
Well, there's one good pub in Bedford, the Wellington, which is like a sort of beer mecca. It's one of those places that has beer mats all across the. It's got about 12 different guest beers on draft, and there's beer mats all lining all the ceiling and all that sort of business. And it's such an amazing pub. All different sorts of people in there. It's so good. It almost makes the awfulness of all the rest of them worthwhile. You go to Bedford, just go to that pub. How about you in Cambridge? Sorry, go on.
Well, Cambridge, I think, is probably not too dissimilar to St Albans in that way. There's a very high concentration of pubs around Mill Road, which are very kind of skewed towards that kind of real ale, small sort of Victorian backstreet boozers, but they do really well. And I suppose Cambridge is an affluent city, and it probably doesn't have a lot of the pressures that other places do. But even so, I mean, I can, like you, Martin, I can think of, since I, was of drinking age, I can think of at least a dozen in Cambridge that have closed down in that time. But yeah, there's some really great pubs still going in Cambridge, going strong. Beer Mecca. That's it's such a great.
There was a big story in the news, wasn't there, about that pub in the Midlands, the Crooked pub that got demolished. Did that? Does that anything to do with you, or did that? I'm not saying you did it.
Yeah, no, I didn't. I wasn't sort of complicit in that. No, that was a sad one. Yeah, I mean that I think is an example of we got a listing application for that matter of days before the building ended up
really
burning down. And I mean, this is the tricky thing, when with that, as I understand it, the pub there linked to a kind of much wider development site. And the fundamental problem with a lot of these buildings is people can realise a much greater value to them if they are demolished than keeping them as a going concern. We don't absolutely know what happened there, but I think the signs are not very good, and it's being investigated for potential arson. But I think the building wasn't listed, and we got the application in, and I suspect that there was sort of some concern from the owners who wanted to make sure that they could sell the land on or develop the land, and so it looks pretty suspicious. But this, I suppose, in some ways, it kind of cases like that. We had one, the Carlton Tavern, which was near to where we used to live in Kilburn, which got knocked down very much as a response to the building being about to be listed.
Right.
So, in some,
was that the one where you walk past one day a pub and see? Was that one?
That was the Carlton.
You told
Tavern.
Me once that you
well, yeah, I mean,
you dashed home, or all right.
It's a good chain.
Tell us the story then.
Well, yeah, so that was one of the ones that we actually came out of the project that we were doing on Interwar Pubs, 1921. Fantastic Charrington's pub with all the kind of tiled exterior, really good free room arrangement, the old saloon bar, public bar, and then the kind of assembly room at the back. Very well preserved, and it was going to be listed, and the owners kind of got wind of this, and overnight just sent some, I mean, it was real kind of cowboy stuff. They sort of drove a digger into the side of it. It wasn't even a kind of proper demolition job. It was a kind of real wrecking job by a few cowboys. And the landlord at the time, or the kind of manager at the time, had no knowledge of this. There's still televisions on the wall, coats hanging up on hooks when the building was demolished. I heard about this, and I lived about 10 minutes away, and I heard that the demolition had begun, so I sort of got on my bike and went over to see what was happening, by which point the entire kind of gable end had fallen, and it was sort of a pile of rubble, but the demolition was still going on. And it was crazy, really. I mean, it was really, apart from anything else, it was hugely dangerous, because there was sort of it was things falling into the road, and there's asbestos in there, and it was shocking, really. But the kind of created, as these things do, just a huge reaction, because people rightly feel angry that for just complete greed, somebody's just demolished something which meant such a great deal to the people who drank there, and for whom had memories which are sort of inextricably linked to that place. So there was kind of great reaction against it, and eventually, because it was of a legal demolition, the council, which is Westminster City Council, who were pretty well funded, ended up enforcing a rebuilding order. So it ends up being rebuilt brick by brick, and if it's there now, you can go and see it, and it's kind of very strange to go back in there, because it's.
So they got it all back, the tiles and everything, all.
Well, I mean, it's those kind of tiles those glazed tiles can't really be produced anymore. So they sort of managed to kind of, as close as possible, match the materials to how it was when demolished.
And who had to pay for that then?
The developer,
the people who knocked it down.
So it was kind of huge. I mean, it must have been so costly for them to rebuild, and they had obviously 2 years of lost revenue from. Or more, really, from when it was knocked down to when it was finally rebuilt. but that was, I mean, it kind of set a real precedent for what could be done by councils, and I think it served as a real deterrent for demolition. And it's partly why the whole Crooked House saga was so shocking. Really, is that it felt that had been such a kind of line in the sand moment, I suppose, the Carlton Tavern, when that was demolished. I think it was 2018. So yeah, it was pretty shocking, really, that ended up happening. And it's sort of, there's a whole load of questions as well about like what protection buildings should have, when they're being considered for listing. And so there's lots of like things that we've sort of thought about, because obviously it sort of makes a mockery of the whole system if somebody can sort of just demolish a building to thwart it being listed. The Crooked House one now, though, I think will again, it sort of galvanised a lot of support for protection and finding ways to for kind of greater protection for buildings like that.
Yeah.